Friends, we are starting the meeting, and I stand here privileged to invite Dr. Madhavan K. Palat for this special occasion, because in our midst today we have one of the greatest scholars who can speak about so many subjects authoritatively. So we are extremely blessed this evening. This occasion is also for honoring Professor Keshavan Velutthat for his achievement as the Kairali Lifetime Achievement Awardee 2024. So I would request Dr. Madhavan Palat to give the memento to Professor Keshavan Velutthat, and I invite Professor Keshavan Velutthat to the stage.
Delighted to have been invited to offer this memento to Professor Keshavan Velutthat, if I may call him Keshavan. The reason is I've known him as a student when he came to JNU long ago, and he's been a friend ever since. So I think Keshavan is slightly more comfortable for me to do so. And nothing gives me greater pleasure than to see an award of this distinction being given to him, because I know his work and his scholarship so well. Although I'm not specialized on his area of history, I've had to read it and make use of it on occasion, and I know the quality of it and how he so well deserves this award. So it is with the greatest pleasure that I have accepted and been able to present this award to Keshavan. Thank you very much.
This evening's main function is a talk by Professor Madhavan Palat about the historical beginnings of the war in Palestine. I think everybody has an idea what the war is about, but only very few people will be knowing how it started. On October 7th, 2023, Hamas fired a number of rockets into Israel and took as hostages a number of Jews. In the rocket attack, about 1,300 people lost their lives. Many people think that was the beginning of the war. It is not true. The war had a very long gestation period, and that is what Professor Madhavan Palat will be enlightening us on today. Instead of saying anything more about this, I would rather invite Dr. Madhavan Palat to address us. I invite Dr. Madhavan Palat for the lecture this evening.
I'm especially happy for another reason that we are having this lecture today. It happens to be the day on which the Indian Constitution was inaugurated, 26 November 1949. So it seems to be an appropriate day on which to reflect upon these momentous events of our last century and how the fate of the Arabs and the fate of India were so peculiarly intertwined because they occurred at the same time. India was partitioned and Pakistan was created in 1947. The Arab world is divided, Palestine is divided, and Israel was created in 1948. And both were done by the same British Empire. And the stories are very similar, but they diverge at important points. And I think the similarities or dissimilarities with India will be very evident to us as we go along the way. Now, as Professor Sudhakaran has just said, the war did not start as recently as a year ago. It is a very, very old war. It's more than a century old. And that is what I'm drawing your attention to. And how the terms of the war were set by 1948 when Israel was created. What is extraordinary to note about this war is that it is so asymmetrical. That is, on the one side you have the entire Western world, the rich world, the developed world with unlimited resources, enough to destroy the world 100 times over or whatever, led by the United States and all its satellites, European, American, Australian, etc., with many others in tow, including India, I'm sorry to say, all supporting America in this war. Against whom? A people who do not have a state, who have no resources, no finances, who've been living on United Nations charity for the past several decades, who certainly have no army, nothing at all. How is it that such huge resources are poured into attacking a people who have nothing at all? Even in colonial times, the wars were less asymmetrical than this one. When, if you study the history of the conquest of Africa and you see how they were attacked, with bows and arrows on one side and machine guns on the other. But this is even more so. How did this happen? And that is a story I wish to tell. And we see how it already was set by 1948. The Palestinians after that had no hope, no chance to win against Israel. Yet they keep fighting. That is also the further story. Why is that they keep fighting, and how are they able to keep fight when they have no resources? They're able to continue to do so. That is itself striking in its reality. So I must point out this. When Israel attacks Palestine, it is attacking a people, not Hamas. Hamas is the name of an organization which is not defined precisely enough. It is part of the Israeli and Western publicity machine which says, or their publicity which says, that it is a war between Israel and Hamas. As if Hamas is a state which is conducting it, which is not. It is barely even a government, and it certainly doesn't have the resources of a state behind it. It is the entire Palestinian people. As you see the war going on, you can see it is the people who are being attacked. Most of the victims are women and children. And all the targets are hospitals, schools, places where you do not expect soldiers. And there aren't soldiers. Of course, the Israeli argument is that soldiers are hiding behind women. Well, that is an easy argument to carry on the war and carry on the massacres. So it's a war between all these states, of which Israel is just the front of it, I must point out. Israel is backed by the United States, and the United States can stop the war literally in one day. It has shown that capacity earlier, as in 1982, when on a phone call from Reagan, Menachem Begin had to stop his invasion of Lebanon. As also in 1956, when the British, French, and Israelis invaded Egypt, it was Eisenhower who put a stop to it, because they had done it without his permission. It's easily possible for them to do so, but of course they won't. That's the other part of the story. But it is a war by all these against a people, not against a state. We must be quite clear about that. So there are three parties there are three parties to this war. The one is Israel and the Zionists. Zionism is the ideology of the creation of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. It is a Jewish nationalist ideology. So you have Zionism as one party, along with that, which becomes Israel. The next is the British Empire that created it. And the third is the Palestinians and the Arabs, what they do about it. That's what we have to explain to ourselves. Now, as the Zionist ideology evolved in the late 19th century, the principal carriers of it, the theorists of it, were people whose names you know, I think, very well. Theodor Herzl, the Australian journalist, who first thought of the idea of going and settling in Palestine and creating a Jewish homeland there. Then Vladimir Jabotinsky, spelt with a J, but pronounced as Zh, Jabotinsky, as a Russian Jew from Odessa. And he was a sort of extreme nationalist, extreme Zionist, who claimed the whole of the land of Palestine for the Jews. He's the one who theorized it most vigorously and in the most extreme fashion. Then David Ben-Gurion, who became the first prime minister of Israel, and others like Nahum Goldman, was not so well known, but himself was an important figure in outlining the theory. Now, these people made the argument that the Jews are not safe anywhere in Europe. They are a persecuted minority everywhere in Europe, and that the persecution is intensifying throughout the 19th century. Therefore, they have no security whatsoever, and there's no prospect of a future security. Therefore, they have to go in search of a homeland where they shall be secure. This was the argument all the way. Now, this argument is very important, and it is actually accurate. Strangely enough, it is correct. The Jews were a persecuted minority, and the rate of persecution is growing. And this is the problem of anti-Semitism in Europe, which is very curious in itself. As you know, the Jews were expelled from the Roman Empire back in the 1st century AD, when the Temple of Jerusalem was destroyed. And the Jews had to be distributed, had to scatter around the world. And ever since, they've never had a home anywhere. They just lived as minorities in various different parts, and periodically were expelled, as they were from England in 1290, from Spain in the late 15th century, and so on. It periodically happened. A large number of them finally ended up in East Europe, especially in Poland and Russia, the Russian Empire then. They did suffer severe persecutions in the course of the medieval centuries. And one of the reasons was that they were looked upon as a people who had murdered Christ. So to the Christians, they were a sheer evil and anathema who had to be isolated, expelled if need be from wherever they were, not to be touched. Otherwise, they were persecuted because they were good financiers. And whenever kings ran out of money, they threw out the Jews because they had borrowed too much money from them, and you could not pay them back. One way of dealing with your debts is to expel or kill off the debtor. That's another solution. So the Jews did suffer throughout medieval times. But that was a kind of persecution that many kinds of poor communities suffer, or those who are engaged in the dangerous game of lending money to princes suffer. When princes run out of money, they might throw you out. That's the only thing. So it went up and down. Sometimes they did very well, sometimes they suffered badly. But something else happened in the 19th century. That is nationalism. After the French Revolution, the Jews were all emancipated, gradually, right across Europe. That is, they came out of the ghetto. Till then, they were confined to the ghetto. But they were now released from the ghetto. They were allowed to work in various different occupations. They could even enter the army and state service. Sometimes they could own land, depending on which country they were. All of these used to be prohibited earlier. And they did very well as they came out of the ghetto. They became very prominent in the world of art and culture and science, in the world of especially music and otherwise the academic world. They were also very prominent in the world of revolutionaries, and they were equally prominent in the world of high finance. All areas which makes every conservative very angry. To a conservative, a revolutionary by definition is the danger and a menace who should be exterminated. Finance banker, that's a pure banker, is an object of hatred to many conservatives because that's the one from whom you borrow money and you're constantly owing them money. The bankers are not industrialists. They're always lending you money and charging very high interest, and there's nothing you hate more than that kind of a financier. And the crises of capitalism are always ascribed to the finance capitalists, and the most prominent amongst them are the Jewish names, of which Rothschild was the most famous. But there are many others. And so it went on. Everything about the Jews seemed to be disruptive. Academics, radical academics, disrupted modern life. They created modernity, which was a disturbance to conservatives. Artists were disruptive. Again, they were too modern and too radical. And revolutionaries, by definition, are radical. So in all these ways, the Jews were very prominent and were very hated for all that they did. Although Christians did as much as the Jews did, but still, the Jews are the ones who were targeted, as if they were the cause of all those difficulties and suffering for the rest of the population. But that is not enough to create this virulent hatred of Jews. In the 19th century, nationalism gathered momentum right across Europe. And nationalism meant, a nation meant, a specific territory which had a single culture to it. That was a nation. And if you had a state in that nation, that became what is known as a nation state, which is what we live with in the modern world today. As we look around the world politically, we see a number of nation states. They're all territories which have a single culture over a single territory with a state above them. The state might sometimes be independent, sometimes not, might be a subordinate state. But still they're all states and nation states. Everyone belongs to a nation, therefore. This became a 19th century fact. Before the 19th century, there was no such thing as everyone belonging to a nation. You were subject to some king or the other. Only in the 19th century, you became a member of a nation. But what about the Jews? The trouble with the Jews was that they were a religion plus a nation which had no territory, and still less a state. You had Jews in every part of Europe, but the Jews had no territory. So they were without a homeland and therefore always suspect. So if you had Jews in France, say, you belonged to a religion which is different from the majority French religion, which is Roman Catholic. The Protestants could safely be, there could be Protestant Frenchmen, and didn't bother the other French. Because it was only a religion, and nothing more than that. But they were good Frenchmen as Protestants. But the trouble with the Jews is, if they were members of a religion alone, it would not have mattered. But they are members of a nation also, called the Jewish nation. And that was scattered all over Europe. So the question always arose to every nationalist, to whom do these Jews owe their loyalty? Is it to our nation or to that nation which doesn't have any territory, the nation of Jews? So as France and Germany or Italy or Britain or Poland or whatever, each of them became more and more nationalist, defined themselves as nationalists, defined their territory, and cultivated their national cultures. The Jews did not have a place in it. And the Jews were suspect, therefore. They seemed to be that they were there and they were not there. They belonged somewhere else. They were too mobile and held in great suspicion. Now, the Jewish answer to this sort of prejudice was to assimilate. That is, to give up being Jews and just become part of the national community in which they were placed. So if you were in France, you assimilated and became a Frenchman. If you're in Germany, you assimilated and became a German. A typical example is Karl Marx. He's a Jew who had assimilated and become a German. Of course, he despised the Jews, and there's no question of him attaching himself to the Jewish religion by any means. But he was a German, and as far as he was concerned, he was just a German. But everybody else considered him a Jew. And this is the point. And if you're a Jew, then you're no longer a German, and not a proper German, because you could have been a Frenchman, you could have been a Dutchman, you could have been a Russian. They formed a single community of their own, but they didn't have a territory of their own. It was that degree of suspicion that attached to the Jews all the time. They were always mobile, and that is why they were called, they had such pejorative terms as being the viscous Jew, the wandering Jew. They did not belong anywhere. For that reason, the hatreds and prejudices against them mounted. It is part of European nationalism. It's not an ancient story. It's a 19th century story from which such anti-Semitism grew with greater and greater intensity. Jews had no place, quite simply, in Europe. There's one other community which is in the same position as the Jews. These are the Gypsies, called the Roma. They also were a single community or a single nation without a territory, and they were equally persecuted, equally despised and hated. And when the extermination began in the 20th century, in Nazi Germany, or under the Nazis, these were the two communities which were singled out for extermination: Jews and Roma, or Gypsies. Only these two were actually singled out for outright extermination, not the others. So it is a problem that arises from 19th century nationalism. But it's a problem that belongs only in Europe. Nowhere else did the Jews suffer this kind of persecution. There's no such thing as really Arab anti-Semitism of this order, or anti-Semitism elsewhere. They might have prejudices against the Jews. It should be of the kind that we call communalism. You might have prejudices of various sorts. You may not like each other. People may not like their neighbors. But that doesn't mean they are planning their extermination under any circumstances. It's a well-known fact that in India we are so full of prejudice against all our neighbors that India seems to hold together because we despise each other, the different linguistic communities. It is such a common practice to trade barbs against each other in this way. But that doesn't matter. You can still hold together. But there's something special about the Jews for this reason. The hatreds against them arose on these grounds. That is why even though the Jews were emancipated after the French Revolution, and they did so well in the course of the 19th century, in all the areas in which they applied themselves, chiefly in the academic disciplines, in the artistic world, in the finance world, and of course in the revolutionary world. Their great prominence was due to the opportunities that are available in the state of bourgeois liberalism that spread across Europe. But they were also hated more and more as it went on. And this is what Theodor Herzl noted at the end of the 19th century. He said the Jews just cannot be secure. They have to get out of Europe. He didn't see any way out of this, except by going into another country, another land, settling there, where they would be in a majority, not a minority any longer, and where they can create their own state. Then they would be the equal of the Europeans in every respect. But until then, they are not secure. They must do it, therefore, and get out of Europe and get to a place which is safe. This is the basis on which they worked out the fundamentals of their strategy of settling in Palestine and there creating a Jewish homeland. This was the plan of Theodor Herzl in the late 19th century. Now the problem is, which is this land exactly? I mean, it is not self-evident that it has to be Palestine. People suggested various different countries which could be used. Argentina was suggested, Western Australia was empty, and so on. They looked around the world empty lands which could be colonized. But the problem was the Jews had come a bit too late. By the 1880s, the whole world had been carved up by the European colonial empires. Even Africa had been carved up completely. There's no piece of land available anywhere where you could go and set up a sovereign state. It is no longer like the opening of the West in America or anything of the kind. Every part of the world is now carved up. So when they looked around and suggested that we settle in Western Australia or Argentina or whatever, they found that nobody was prepared to give them a land where they could create a sovereign state. They're prepared to give them land to settle, but not to create a sovereign state. But Herzl's point is not enough to go, he said it's not enough to go and settle there, because then you become a minority all over again in another country. And that doesn't help matters. So you have to be able to create a sovereign state. But where is that available? They decided on Palestine because it is the original home of the Jews. That original means 2,000 years old. Earlier it had been theirs. And they built up an argument that is so emotive on the ground that they had been expelled from there. That is where the Temple of Solomon had once stood, and so on, and therefore they must go back there. It is the promised land. Well, you know the whole biblical story. I do not have to repeat it. And they said, this is the place that we will be able to go and settle in. Of course, they made it also into a right to settle there because that is their original homeland. That is the claim. But making a claim of that kind, of course, you can see how it is based upon entirely the history of a migration and nothing more than that. If that were to be generally applied, of course, all of human migrations for past 2,000 years will have to be reversed. If you can ask for anybody to go back to their original homeland. The Europeans will have to go to South Russia. Indians can go into Central Asia and Africa. And this is interesting. The Dravidian world south of the Vindhyas can go and occupy Pakistan, and so on. It has been quite an extraordinary turnaround of fortunes in the world if you just redo all the migrations. But that didn't matter to the Zionists. It is an article of faith. It was a pure dogma. And as you know, dogma is something you can never argue with. You can never argue rationally. So it is their homeland. It is now for them to go and get it. How do you get it is the point. And this is the next stage of their argument as it developed. They said, Palestine is empty. There are only a few Arabs there. A few, they said, doesn't matter. And after all, they're just Arabs. They're underdeveloped people. The usual colonial argument, they're backward, natives, and so on. The assumption was that if they're Arabs, they can go to other Arab countries. They need not remain in Palestine. And the Zionists could decide who could go and live in Palestine. Such was the assumption. And they made the claim that essentially it's an empty land. So they said, we want, people without land and a land without people. That's how they made the claim. The land without people being Palestine and people without a land being the Jews. So this is a slogan under which it was claimed for a very long time, until the 1970s at least, this sort of argument was made, that the Palestinians are not really residents of Palestine. They're just Arabs who could be anywhere. And nothing more than that. But essentially, the argument is based on the fact that it is an underpopulated territory. And if you're underpopulated, you do not have a right to occupy a whole territory. This is the argument made very strongly by Jabotinsky, who was a principal theorist, in fact. He saw all the arguments, he saw all the objections. He said, all right, if you say it is populated, he said, the whole point is it is underpopulated, which might or might not be true. Well, what is underpopulated? How do you know that any territory is underpopulated? And what is the measure of underpopulation? We can never say. And if it's underpopulated, they have no right to prevent other people who have no place to stay from coming in. Therefore, you must admit the Jews to let them come and stay there. The prima facie, it seemed reasonable because it was many parts of Palestine were deserted or were deserts. And therefore, they said you can have them come in. But, there's really no way of measuring what is underpopulated. You can say the whole of Siberia is underpopulated. Tibet is underpopulated. The whole of Canada, USA, all these can be considered underpopulated areas in the world. What is the right density of population? Even India could be appear underpopulated. I can give you a simple statistic. In 1950, India had approximately 350 million. And until the 1970s, we were always saying that we are overpopulated, we need population control and family planning and so on, if you remember those days. We have stopped hearing anything about all that now, about population control. Today, the population of India is 1,500 million or so. So over these years, our population is multiplied 5 times. More than 1,000 million has been accommodated in the same area. And we've also grown richer. There's been economic growth since then. So if India could have hosted another 1,000 million over this time, it must have been underpopulated in 1950, at the time that Israel was created, about that time. So you can easily say that India was underpopulated even then. So these are not arguments that are valid in any way. There's no measure of underpopulation. It's all a matter of technology, how well you can grow food and how many people can be settled on any piece of land anywhere at all. And if it is an problem of underpopulation, well, the whole of Siberia and Canada are available. Of course, that was never considered because those were sovereign territories held by somebody else. Now, it's not as if the Zionists were unaware about this. They knew very well that while they made these arguments, they were actually plain and simple grabbing in other people's territories. And they admitted to the fact. First of all, they said it is a colonization project. They didn't hesitate to say it's colonization. Only now the Israelis and the West say it's not colonization. In those days, they called it colonization, pure and simple, and part of colonialism. They had no doubt about it. But even a person as David Ben-Gurion, who is, you might say, a great hero and icon of Israel, the way Jinnah is of Pakistan. This is what he said in 1956. Let me read it out to you. He said this to Naim Goldman. Why should the Arabs make peace? If I was an Arab leader, I would never make terms with Israel. That is natural. We have taken their country. Sure, God promised it to us, but what does that matter to them? Our God is not theirs. We come from Israel. It's true. But 2,000 years ago. And what is that to them? This is David Ben-Gurion saying all this. This is not an Arab saying it. Please note. There has been anti-Semitism, the Nazis, Hitler, Auschwitz. But was that their fault? They see only one thing. We have come here and stolen their country. Why should they accept that? They may perhaps forget in 1 or 2 generations' time, but for the moment there is no chance. So it is simple. We have to stay strong and maintain a powerful army. Our whole policy is there. Otherwise, the Arabs will wipe us out. You can't accuse him of not being unrealistic. He knows exactly what he's doing and what he has done to the Arab population of Palestine, to the Palestinians. So they are settling and driving out a Palestinian population who are locally resident. But how will they actually carry it out as a colonization project? Their next point was, they said we can do so only with the help of a major imperial power. And who is that? The British Empire, quite obviously. They tried the Ottoman Empire, but the Sultan was not interested. Well, he himself was losing territories, not gaining, so he was in no condition to do anything at all. They tried the Russian Empire, but again, the Russian Empire is on its back foot and hardly capable of carrying out colonial adventures so far away. The German Empire was not interested. That left only the French and the British. And the British were obviously the best candidate because it is the largest empire, the most powerful one, and stretched right across the globe, which had an interest everywhere, in every sense of the term. So they approached the British. They, meaning all these people, including, and the main propagandist of the Zionist idea in Britain was a man called Chaim Weizmann. They all approached the British. And they argued that the colonization project, planting a Jewish homeland in Palestine, can be carried out only as part of a British imperial project, as part of British imperial policy. It was very clear to these Zionists. Colonialism was internal to the Zionist argument. It's not something that only Palestinians today have fished out of their hat box or something like that. It is very much part of the argument. Only now they're trying to pretend it is not. So they have to interest the British Empire in some way to allow the Jewish homeland to be planted. How would they do so? They said, we have to appeal to the British in some way. And the best way of appealing is to their strategic interests. And Herzl, Jabotinsky, Ben-Gurion, all of them said, Israel, if you create Israel here, the Jewish homeland, you will create a European rampart against barbarism. A pure colonial idea. You are planting a part of Europe amidst the Arabs, who will always be on the side of any European project against the Arabs in future. So you are actually protecting any imperial interest that you have in the region. They're very clear about it. And the British bought into this particular strategy. They said, that's a good argument. It is useful to us. And the Zionists saw what the British would be interested in. The reason is the Suez Canal. The west of the Suez Canal was Egypt. It is already under British control. The east of the Suez Canal is Palestine. It is under nobody's control. That is, it is under the Ottoman Empire, which is getting steadily weaker. And the danger was that the Germans might gain control, or some other Arabs might gain control and frustrate or threaten British imperial communications. And to the British, it is British imperial strategy is a matter of dogma, that you have to control the Suez in order to keep up communication with India. Otherwise, the Indian Empire is endangered. So the Suez became an extraordinary important feature of all British strategic calculations. Now, having Palestine under their control was an aspect of gaining or making lines of communications to India secure. And this is what the Zionists told the British. We'll be there to protect your interest in every way. And this worked. Now, what were all the British and imperial calculations? What made them accept this argument, all these arguments? The first was what is called Christian Zionism. Now, Christian Zionism, it doesn't mean they were Jews at all. They were Christians who supported the Zionist cause on the ground that the Jews actually belong to this territory and they should be allowed to go back to their territory. They have their right to go back to their original homeland. These are what are called evangelical Christians, who were an important force among the upper class in Britain in the 19th century, amongst the conservative upper class. And it was these ideas were propagated, most importantly, by people like Anthony Ashley Cooper, who was the 7th Earl of Shaftesbury, an important public figure, holder of many offices, and highly respected for the major social reforms that he supported. All the good causes that we would nowadays see NGOs in India doing. Child welfare, women's labor, factory labor, safety, chimney sweeps, all these kinds of issues, Catholic emancipation and so on. He supported all these causes. And he's a very influential and immensely respected public figure of that kind. And a whole lot of British conservative figures propagated these ideas that the Jews should be allowed to return to their homeland. And that is very important when it comes from influential figures of this kind. And sure enough, it was carried on to a man we are going to know only too well, Arthur James Balfour, another such evangelical Christian. Balfour was one time Prime Minister of England, and in 1917, during the war, he was Foreign Secretary. And he's the one who issued what is known as the Balfour Declaration, which promised a homeland for Jews in Palestine, and that they would be allowed to immigrate and settle there. Of course, he was not the only one who decided the issue. He was merely the Foreign Secretary who signed the letter, which was written to Lord Rothschild, saying that this is possible. The whole British cabinet had supported it. But these are all people who believed in a cause of this kind. And the Jews made full use of this in their lobbying of this particular ideology. It provided immense public moral legitimation to the idea of a Jewish homeland. But there's a further argument that they used, which was that the imperial strategists found useful. European anti-Semitism was not only very widespread, it was particularly widespread amongst European conservatives. That means the upper class. And to them, getting rid of the Jews was an important item in their program. There were too many Jews sitting around in Europe, and too many Jews coming into Europe from Eastern Europe, from Russia and Poland, where they were persecuted. It is something like the immigration problem now in Europe. Now it is of African Muslims or Middle Eastern Muslims. Then it is East European Jews. So how to prevent them coming and how to send them off somewhere else? That was the idea that is what the strategy they were working out. They found it a brilliant answer to settle them all in Palestine. Why have them come into England? Let them go to Palestine. Create a homeland there. And if that turns out to be a bulwark against Arabs, Germans, and a protection for the British Empire, so much the better. So you solved a problem of anti-Semitism in Europe by getting rid of them this way. Send them all off to Palestine. To the European conservatives and the European anti-Semites, this is a wonderful solution. And the Zionist propagandists made full use of this argument. They told the European leaders, especially the British, look, you people despise us. You do not want us here. Well, why don't you just dump us in Palestine? We'll be only too glad to go, and we'll be of use to you. That is more or less the argument that people like Chaim Weizmann and so on presented, and it is gladly received. This is part of a wider European strategy of dealing with the Jews. As I said, European anti-Semitism had grown to such extremes that the Jews felt extremely insecure in Europe. And to the Europeans, they didn't know what more to do with the Jews. There are only two answers available. One is to dump them somewhere, like this in Palestine. The way the British government, the way the British government has thought of Rwanda, where you can dump Muslim immigrants, get them out of England. The same way, get them out of here and put them in Palestine. The other solution, which they did not think of straight away, but it came up in the course of the 20th century, was to exterminate them. That's the other part of it. It's difficult to think of it easily, but as you know, in the 1940s, this is exactly what was tried. Slaughter the Jews completely. So between exterminating them and expelling them, you solve the problem of having too many Jews in Europe. And that's exactly what's happened. Europe has solved its problem of Jews by dumping them in Israel, or giving them the land of Palestine to occupy, and made use of them at the same time. They are a useful European strategic support. So their own anti-Semitism worked in this way. And it looks as if it is a generous gesture on their part. It is not because they were fond of the Jews that they gave them a piece of land. It is because they detested them that they gave them this piece of land. And to make use of them and say, you be useful to us by going and settling there. And that worked brilliantly. With the result now, there are no Jews left in Europe, practically. And the Arabs have been saddled with this particular problem. And the Arabs are now accused of anti-Semitism, and the Europeans claim that they have cleansed themselves of anti-Semitism. They haven't. They remain as anti-Semitic as before, but there are no Jews left for them to work their anger against. They're all now in Israel or in America. That's how it was sorted out. The support for Israel is not based upon any love of Jews. It is based on a purely geopolitical calculation, nothing else. The third point, of course, is the Suez strategy, which the British followed and which I've already elaborated. And all the British leaders, one after the other, be it Churchill or Milner, people like C.P. Scott of the Manchester Guardian, or Mark Sykes, Herbert Samuel, who was the first High Commissioner in Palestine, every one of them saw Palestine as a major strategic asset for the British out there. And this is one of the best things that they could do. So there's sort of universal agreement right across the board from the entire conservative establishment. And even to a significant extent from the Labour establishment, Labour Party. They also made it quite clear in the 1920s when the immigration began and the Arabs were beginning to demand self-rule or self-determination. They made it quite clear. No question of self-determination as long as the Arabs are in a majority. Only after the Arabs become a minority will there be a self-determination. And Churchill said it so explicitly in 1922. I could read it out to you. 1921, he said it. All of us here would have passed away from the earth, and also our children and our children's children, before it is achieved, it being Arab self-determination. That means it was never going to happen. And that's exactly how it worked. When the Jews got the majority, of course, there was self-determination. They even created a state. But while the Arabs were there in majority, there was no question of it. But it is not enough to give them the land. What do you do actually about the Arabs was the problem for the British imperial strategists. The whole of the Arab world was, as you know, under the Ottoman Empire, up to the end of the Ottoman Empire in 1922. So during the First World War, the Ottoman Empire, which is on the side of the Germans, and therefore the British enemy, had to be expelled from the Arab world. And the obvious way of doing so, one of the obvious instruments, was to promote Arab nationalism, for it to work against the British, against the Ottomans, which is exactly what the British then set about doing, which is what the career of people like Lawrence of Arabia and so on tell us. He was used for this purpose. The British promised the Arabs their own independent kingdoms or states after the war. And they were true to their word in one peculiar way. They created a series of Arab states, all kingdoms, all conservative, just like the Indian states, princely states. So you had Jordan, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, all of them, a string of such states, and Egypt, all under British protection. And conservative princes are not ever going to be nationalists. They can't afford to be, because the first thing that will happen with nationalism is that they will be overthrown by a nationalist leader. Syria and Lebanon were under the French after the war. So the entire territory was tied up in this way. The promise was made good that we'll create independent states, but it was independent states of this kind, which is under conservative monarchies, which are effectively British protectorates, all of them. They were taken out of Ottoman rule and put under British and French rule, and all these kings could pretend to be independent in this way. In the Palestinian area alone, the Jewish homeland was being created by furthering Jewish immigration. And as long as that was going on, of course, there was no state there. The British were under full control. So you can see how they worked it out that there would be no danger of Arab nationalism ever threatening them, as long as you had the princes there. It was exactly the same as having the princes in India. This is the policy of the princely states idea. Well, they had learnt it all in India, they applied it there. And it worked very well there. It didn't work in India. India was free of that because Indian nationalism was much too strong for the princes to be able to block it. But in the Arab world, there was no Arab nationalism. Therefore, the princes turned out to be instruments of British policy. And that's how it worked. Now, the results of imperial strategy are very evident. At the time of the Balfour Declaration in 1917, 94% of Palestine was Arab, or Palestinian Arab. By 1926, it was already 18% Jewish. The Arab population had declined. The Jews bought up land and expelled as many Arabs as they could steadily as the years went by, with British help, of course. By 1931, it had become 31%. In 1939, the Jews were already 39%. And I must remind you, between 1936 and 1939, there was a major Arab uprising against the British rule and against immigration. And it was put down with a degree of ferocity and brutality that we have known in India in 1857. Same sort. There were a series of Jallianwala Bagh types of massacres and God knows what else. The usual colonial policies that were followed in these 3 years. The Arab population of Palestine declined by 10% in those 3 years, either by killing or by expulsion. Thereafter, it was the Jews all the way, gaining momentum. In 1948, more than half the Arab population was expelled. That is when the State of Israel was created. And in 1939, out of 1.3 million Arabs, 700,000 had become refugees. Israel had been established and it had expanded to what Israel officially is today. The territorial statistics are equally interesting. When the first partition plan was made in 1937, 17% was reserved for Jews, but even that entailed the expulsion of 200,000 Arabs. It was only a plan, it was not put into effect. But in 1947, when the United Nations Committee on Palestine finalized it in its partition plan, it gave 56% to the Jews, which meant expulsion of the Palestinians. It was always assumed at every time, in every case, wherever Jews settled, there will be no Arabs. The Arabs will have to leave the place. The Jewish settlement policy was not to have mixed populations, always to set up their farms and their enterprises and use only Jewish labor, only Jewish enterprises, and only Jewish finances, and have nothing to do with the Arabs. So the Arabs have to get out of the place altogether. In one form or the other, some form of coercion was applied, and they all got out. So by 1949, 78% of Palestine was now in Jewish hands. That is Israel. And only 22% remained with Palestinians. That is Gaza and the West Bank. That's all. The very places where the war is now going on. So the Israelis gained practically the whole of the country, expelling all the Arabs, and they had the backing of Britain, the rest of Europe, and America. All the publicity machine worked in America very well. Such major figures in Britain as Lord Rothschild and in America as Justice Brandeis and so on were all contributing to the effort, raising money, doing their publicity, justifying the actions in every way, denouncing the Arabs for being unreasonable by wanting to hang on to their country, and so on. It just went on and on. And the State of Israel had been created safely. Now, the obvious question now is the third part of the story. What were the Arabs doing? Why couldn't they defend their own country? This is rather peculiar. The whole place is Arab. They're all Muslim. There should be no internal divisions. Yet, there was no such thing as a concerted Arab effort to stop the immigration. There was no such thing as Arab nationalism, nothing of the kind. There was no Palestinian nationalism even until the 1960s and 70s with the Palestinian Liberation Organization. Only then you have what we can call a recognizable modern nationalism appearing there. Nearly a century after the Zionists have been active with the help of the British and so on. So there was nothing Arab. There's no joint Arab activity anywhere. There's not even a Palestinian action against the British and Zionist immigration policies. Nothing at all. The only people who protested were people of patrician background, notables, who were respected community leaders, no doubt. But they were not popular leaders, not of the kind that would have been mobilized by a nationalism. So they had absolutely no strength with which to respond. They could always write good articles, write nice books, and be make very effective speeches. I mean, good speeches, but certainly not mobilize a popular movement. Nothing at all. So the Zionists and the British walked into an empty space, as it were. Ideologically empty space. There was no response. There was no action on the part of the Arabs. And this is very strange indeed, you might say. On the other hand, the British had created a series of Arab states who were committed to supporting the British and Israel, therefore. Egypt, Jordan, Iraq, and Saudi Arabia, all of them, under princes who cannot afford to support any Arab nationalist cause. And they're all completely under British rule, with Syria and Lebanon under French rule. And that is how it worked out. Each of these princes, each of these kings, all were busy trying to work out special bilateral relationships with Britain or with France, as the case may be, and seeking the best advantageous position that each one of them could extract from it. For example, Egypt was ruled by a prince of the Muhammad Ali dynasty, nominally independent from 1922, but it was completely under British control and always subject to, like all our princes, they could be deposed at any time if the British High Commissioner there chose to do so, and he felt that the king was not doing his job properly. That is, he was not supporting the British strategic purposes. And it came to such an extreme, for example, in 1942, the then British High Commissioner, called Miles Lampson, actually drove his tanks up into the Abdeen Palace in the middle of the night and told King Farouk, sign on the dotted line and appoint so-and-so, the Prime Minister, Mustafa al-Nahas. He ordered him to appoint him as the Prime Minister at that moment. This kind of action, pure colonial of a very 19th century sort, you might say, but 19th century continues into the middle of the 20th century, went on. And it was only in 1952, when the Egyptian revolution occurred under Najib and later Nasser, that this ended. Till then, it was entirely under British hands. Syria from 1919 to 1946 was under French control, totally. And they didn't even play any role in any of the Arab nationalist efforts at that time. The individuals might have made various kinds of plans, but nothing more than that. Iraq was created in 1921 with a king called Faisal, the son of Hussein ibn Ibn Ali, the Amir, son of Hussein ibn Ali, the Sharif of Mecca, the Hashemite prince, and who was a king of Hejaz. All right, he was a prince with an ancient lineage and therefore supposedly great authority, but he didn't have actually any authority whatsoever. Hussein ibn Ali, although he was descended from the Prophet and so on, did not have any particular authority locally. And this prince was just a man who was placed there by the British. The same with Transjordan, which was created also in 1921 under Faisal's brother. He was another son of Hussein ibn Ali. He was very active in extracting concessions from the British as much as he could, and his main ambition was to expand his territory into Palestine. So he actually supported the creation of the Jewish homeland, the partition of Palestine, in the hope that he'll get the rest of Palestine for himself, and therefore for Jordan. This was his policy. So you had you had these Arab princes, all either under the British thumb or supporting British policies in these respects. As for Saudi Arabia, it was first under the Sharif of Mecca, and then from 1925 it passed under Ibn Saud. The Saudi dynasty was set up then. His strategy was all the time to work with the British as their protectorate and support all their causes as long as he got advantages in competition with Abdullah of Transjordan. Abdullah of Jordan was trying to expand into Palestine. This man's ambition, Ibn Saud's ambition, was to prevent that expansion taking place. So they were just competing amongst each other and trying to get British support in both cases. And in the War of 1948, the Saudis played almost no role whatsoever at that time. So when you look around the entire Arab world, there's nobody supporting the Palestinian cause. And the Zionists had a walkover, as it were. So all the nationalisms that we expect from the Arabs, nothing of it came about. The first nationalism that in some sense emerged was in 1928, Muslim religious nationalism in Egypt, led by Hassan al-Banna, what is called the Muslim Brotherhood. That was the first sort of nationalist movement. But it was more Islamic than Arab, and more Egyptian than Arab. So it did not have the capacity to mobilize Arab opinion in favor of a Palestinian cause against the Zionists and the British. And it was only from much later that they became properly active. The real Arab nationalist cause, or Arab nationalist movement, which tried to unite all the Arabs in a secular, plural politics, something like the Indian, you might say, Indian nationalism, that came about only in 1940 under what is known as the Ba'ath movement. And that is prominent in Egypt, Syria, and later Iraq. But it is as late as 1940s when Israel is about to be formed. Even then, it did not gather any strength and popular support until Nasser took it on. And only in the 1950s did Baathism really become a political force of Arab nationalism trying to unite the Arabs, and Nasser tried it. But it didn't work because it was too much of an Egyptian force, not an Arab, fully Arab national force. And the other Arabs, like the Syrians, got fed up with domination by Egypt. And when Nasser did create the United Arab Republic of Egypt and Syria in 1958, it broke up in 1961. And after that, no such attempt has ever been made. So all these failed, and none of them actually supported the cause properly. Now, this is where the comparison with India is extraordinary and strange. You have an Arab population in this world. They're all Arabs in a compact territory, and they have one religion. So you might say no internal divisions at all. Yet they cannot create a national movement even. Forget about a national state. Nothing came, and even now there isn't. India, on the other hand, is about as divided as you can think of. It's as plural as you can think of, with all the languages, all the three major religions, which have any number of conflicts, plus various kinds of social structures like castes and tribes, which indicate or generate divisions of an extraordinary kind. Yet, it was possible for India to create movements which could keep on uniting this disparate mass. Unite at various levels, be it as Hindu, as Islamic, as Sikh, regionally along all our linguistic states, which are themselves nationalisms, and all over the territory of India, a pan-Indian nationalism that shall unite all of them as a secular nationalism. All these together assembled all these multiple forces and brought them under one general coalition agreement, which we call secular nationalism or Indian nationalism. And they were able to create an Indian state at the end of it, although with one important failure. The British were able to hive off Pakistan. That's true. But for the rest, it happened. Now, how did that happen in India? But not a trace of it in the Arab world, where all the advantages were on the Arab side, you might say. I would say the fundamental reason is that the Arabs had such a very special relationship with Islam that they gave priority to Islam over Arab nationalism. Islam was a creation of the Arab world. That's how they saw it. Muhammad was obviously an Arab, as we know. And the great days of Islam was when the two caliphates had existed. Of course, that had come to an end in the 13th century when Hulagu Khan completely destroyed the Abbasid Caliphate. So it is the Arabs who had created Islam, and the relationship between Islam and the Arabs was so intimate that to every Arab it seemed that the task of the future was to renew Islam. The answer to colonial rule and colonial domination did not lie in nationalism, but in the renewal of Islam. If you solve this problem of why Islam succumbed to colonialism, if you can renew Islam, regenerate it and strengthen it, then the Arab problem will also be solved. You'd be able to create an Arab nation which will be independent of colonial domination. So all their focus went on to Islam, not on the Arabs. On the other hand, the Turks, the Ottoman Empire, they went straight forward to Turkish nationalism, which of course was integrated to Islam, no doubt, but Islam did not take priority. In fact, as you know, Ataturk actually subordinated Islam. He was fiercely and militantly secular. So Islam did not have that role there. It could not dominate. To the Arabs, it always dominated. They could never work out a nationalism. There was never an Arab nationalism to this day. There hasn't been. Nothing that you can compare, in any sense, think of like Indian nationalism. And I think this would be one major reason. When they did think of nationalism, obviously there were many thinkers who were nationalists. Each of them went for one of the territorial nationalisms: Egyptian, Syrian, Iraqi. These are the three. There could obviously be not even Iraqi, rarely Egyptian and Syrian. There could not be any nationalism in the Saudi world, hardly any in the Jordanian or Iraq, because they're run by princes who were stooges of the British. So it was but Egypt had a stronger history and a stronger capacity for generating a nationalism. And all the thinkers of those territories from Egypt and Syria thought in terms of only their own nationalism. Therefore, not of Islam, but in the case of Egypt, they went back to Pharaonic times. In the case of Syria, they went back to Phoenician times. Or in Iraq, to Babylonian times. The Saudis had nowhere to go back to. They were just camel drivers who were tribals, who had acquired a new kingdom. So none of them actually did anything of the kind. On the other hand, in India, they could actually generate these multiple nationalisms and create a pan-Indian nationalism in spite of all the divisions. But more than that, when there were a few voices who did think in terms of a pan-Arab nationalism, people like Azuri or Ibrahim al-Yaziji, who's the most important of the lot. And their first attempt to organize one, as I said, was the Ba'ath parties in 1940. But it began and ended very quickly. It was very feeble and didn't get very far. And the ones who thought of it most energetically and creatively were in Syria. And the way they thought about it always was that Syria is the most developed part of the Arab world. After all, it's where the caliphate had once existed. Therefore, any nationalism, others would be invited to join the Syrian Arab nation, or it is too early in other parts of the Arab world to do so. So Syrians sort of created a hierarchy of possible members of the future Arab nation when they thought of it in these terms. Now compare that to the Indian. When the Indian nationalists thought of an Indian union or an Indian nation, everybody was equally member of the nation. There's no question of saying, this part of India is less developed, therefore it shall not be admitted right now, it shall be admitted later. Nobody's waiting to be admitted. The Syrians assume that others are waiting to be admitted to the Syrian nation when they create one. In India, that is not the assumption that was made. Anybody, from the most developed modern world of Bombay to the most tribal world anywhere else in central India or in east or whatever, were all part of the Indian nation. And the assumption was that after you create the Indian Republic, all their differences would be worked out and structures of power should be organized accordingly. The further point, if you look, when the Arabs looked for leaders, and even somebody as creative as Rashid Rida looked for it, they said there are no leaders. Therefore, we have to turn to the army. That's where you'll find the leaders. Hence people like Najib and Nasser and so on. Now that's a very important reflection on the state of Arab nationalism. They didn't have popular leaders, and they had to turn to the army to find leaders. Compare that to the Indian. The one thing in India, whatever you say about Indian leaders, that they're all, without exception, popular. They're all elected from the beginning of the 20th century, in some way or the other. There's no question of anybody by hereditary right becoming a leader. None of the princes became leaders. There's no question of any military man or a bureaucrat ever being asked to take over leadership at any point, at any crisis moment even, in India. It always had to be. However you might despise the particular range of leaders on offer, there's no question of a military man being put there. In Pakistan, it worked the opposite. As almost immediately after independence, you had military dictatorships established because of the weakness of the Pakistani nationalism. In India, nationalism was so deeply and broadly based that nobody else could come up, except popular leaders in one way or the other. Of course, the Indian Army and Civil Service argue the reason is they are apolitical. Their traditions are apolitical, and it is in their wisdom that they've kept out of the political competition. Now, that is a self-serving argument made by the Indian Army and the Indian Civil Services, or the Administrative Service, as the case may be. In colonial times, the Army and the Civil Service were the political masters of India. They were the politicians. They ruled India politically. They were not apolitical at all. They were apolitical in Britain. But in India, they were not apolitical. It's only after independence they were reduced to an apolitical role by Indian democracy, in which Nehru played such an important role. The army suffered a double demotion. They came under popular leaders and they came under the defense secretary. One reason why the army hates Nehru so much. He's the one nations and finance. The rest they wanted control over for themselves. So they only meant autonomy. In India, it was absolutely clear from the start that India would be totally and utterly independent. There's not going to be any compromise about it. And anyone who compromised about it were the ones who were considered the British stooges. And amongst them, it was people like Gandhi and Nehru who led it, made it absolutely clear it should always be independent. And Nehru's point was always that. He was a statesman who worked out the foreign policies for maintaining that independence, and after independence, the non-alignment was to sustain it. But throughout the struggle for independence, it was to be only a totally independent India. There's no two ways about it. Now, one of the foremost historians of the history of Arab thought, a man called Albert Hourani, made a passing comment at the end of his book, saying, in the Arab world, there was no Gandhi. He made it a comment without further elaboration, and he passed on. And that struck me very strongly. And I see now why. Gandhi was not merely working for independence like Nehru. He thought of much more than independence. Gandhi was not a simple Indian nationalist who just wanted the independence of India, like most nationalists did. He was not one who was trying to protect Indian traditions. That's a serious mistake to make about Gandhi. Not at all. Many even doubt whether he was Hindu. He claimed he was Hindu, but there are many who say he was not at all Hindu even. And I don't seem to have any record of Gandhi ever going to worship in a temple. I don't think there is any. I've been asking friends to let me know if they have any record of it. So far, nobody's able to come up with one. Our subsequent prime ministers have all been going to temples and worshipping and proclaiming themselves. Gandhi never did so. So Gandhi was much above being a Hindu, being a mere Indian nationalist. There's something more. He was a person who was trying to remake humanity by his critique of modern civilization. It was a critique that was so total that he thought it was possible to remake on such a scale that the only comparisons that I can think of are Nietzsche and Karl Marx, who thought that it was possible to reconstitute humanity on a completely new foundation. And South Africa and India were for Gandhi just laboratory experiments, where he could carry out those experiments through his non-violence and satyagraha and all the rest. But he was not stopping at India. He was proposing it for the whole world. India is just one place to demonstrate the possibility where it could be done. And South Africa was the earlier place where he had demonstrated that possibility. So here we have a mind and all his followers who thought in terms of a critique, so fundamental a critique of modern civilization that you can think of remaking the total of humanity. He didn't succumb to European civilization the way the Arabs did. He thought of it totally independently. He was offering something else to all of humanity. And he led a major independence and nationalist movement. He did all. He worked at all levels. As a leader of humanity, as a leader of the independence movement, as a thinker on that scale, in a way that nobody in the Arab world ever did. And he didn't confine himself to Hinduism or Hindu-Muslim friendship or any such thing. He went far, far above that. And I think this is what Albert Hourani felt or put his finger on when he said this. That in India you have had a thinker and a political leader. He's both a thinker and political leader with such immense moral power over his population, over his followers, that he could think on the scale. And that is the basis of, I think, Indian independence, that we had leaders of this type, and all their ideas cascaded down to us, down to the bottom in this way. When we think of Indian independence, we are thinking of a much more fundamental, in a much more fundamental way than any of these people in the Arab world did, or in many other parts of the world, like in Africa or Southeast Asia and so on. Only in India did it happen on this scale. And that is why you have no Arab nation or Arab nationalism, whereas you have an Indian nationalism which can actually assert its independence and preserve it, as we have seen over all these years. So the fate of the Arabs is that, or why Palestine has completely fallen victim to the Israelis, is because of a situation like this. There is no Arab nation. There is no Arab nationalism. There is no concerted Arab action. Every Arab state thinks that they will just work for themselves and not for the Palestinians. The Palestinians are not a problem for any one of them. Let them be. Let the Israelis do what they want as long as they can get on with their job. So however strong the emotional feeling about the manner in which the Palestinians suffer, and the Arab populations do have very strong opinions on that, none of the Arab states are concerned. Even Egypt has given up its attempted leadership of an Arab nationalism or nation after Anwar Sadat made up with the Israelis. There isn't any. So the Palestinians are fighting all alone, completely alone. But yet, they fashioned their own nationalism from the 1970s, 1670s, under the Palestinian Liberation Organization, and that has gone on, developed further with the Hamas. So there is a nationalism there, and it's not going away. Once there's a nationalism, it will not disappear. And that is partially the strength of it. It's not dependent on any state, but is dependent upon the fact that the population has been mobilized in this way, but has been mobilized in a very restricted space. Thank you very much.
While you have, I'm Krishnan for the rest. While you have summarized the history of the Palestine in evolution, so to speak, you have not told us how you justify the Hamas action against the Israelis.
It's an ongoing war. It's a war that has been going on since 1920, to be precise, when the first conflict seriously arose. And it has been a very one-sided war that has been continuing over the whole century. So this is one of the many actions, that's all. If you think this Palestinian, okay, yes, it is barbarous, you can say it, but war is never nice. There's no such thing as a good war or a gentle war or any such thing. In a war, you kill people. And by the way, as you know, from the practically all wars in history, but particularly in the 20th century, the main victims of the wars are civilians, not soldiers. We keep on erecting memorials to soldiers who've died, and we never erect memorials to the civilians who've died. They're the ones who bear the brunt of the war, and they're the ones who bear the cost of the war in every way. I mean, they sustain the wars. So this is one of those sets of actions, no doubt. But if you want further detail about exactly whether or not it's barbarous, I mean, my idea was not getting into such detail, but since you raised it, let me say so. You see, the charges that have been brought against the Hamas is that they attacked civilians, they raped women and children, and therefore it is a degree of barbarity which required a response. Namely, if you kill 1,200 Israelis in this way, you must kill 50,000 Palestinians as a result. The point is, what is the evidence as to who killed how many? There is no actual independent investigation as to who was killed and how they were killed. Apparently, there are only photographs. There are only 3 proper witnesses that have ever been investigated. For 1,200 dead, only 3. This is a UN investigation of the process. Now, and as you know, you can always create photographs of people. The girls who were raped what are the photographs shown? They are shown with their underwear, which is red. Well, if that's the evidence of rape, we know photographs can be manufactured in any number of ways. So the sources are always Israeli in every way. Secondly, the attackers were not only the Hamas. There were other attackers. One is the Palestinian, People's Liberation Front of Palestine. That's another organization which is part of it. And a large number of civilians who were not part of Hamas, strictly part of the organization, or of the Palestinian Liberation Front, who also participated in it. So it's not just Hamas. We have to beware of the stories that are always given to us in the press, as we know, when a war takes place. You recall a little later, when Israel was in, a case was brought to the International Criminal Court against Israel for genocide by South Africa. The very next day, Israeli intelligence put out a story that the whole of the UN relief mission was riddled with Hamas agents. So the relief mission which was supplying the Palestinians, refugees, were all Hamas agents. That very day, the moment the Israeli intelligence said so, all the European nations and America just cut off all financing of the UN relief mission within 24 hours. No investigations done whatsoever. Now it's plain as daylight that when an intelligence body puts out any information, you must never believe it. You know what intelligence does. It is manipulating public opinion. Even prime ministers are victims of intelligence assessments. We know that again and again. The way intelligence groups fight amongst each other and manipulate their prime ministers. What to say about the public. And subsequently, of course, they've said, no, people have admitted that all this is false information. It was done just to counter the South African case brought against Israel for the genocide. So all these we have to bear in mind when we go in for such condemnations. But this is the only information I have. I've not conducted an actual investigation of what the Hamas did. But I'm always ready to question all these cases. The same happened with Saddam Hussein, when they said all the babies' tubes were pulled out of the newborn babies were lying in their cribs in the hospital, and their oxygen was pulled out. It turned out that whole story was concocted in America. And we were all made victims of that, made complete fools of, as if Saddam Hussein was killing babies in Kuwait. But that comes out 10 years later, when nobody's interested in the story any longer, and Saddam is dead. Not that Saddam is a good man, but that's another matter. The point is we are all being manipulated. And this will be one of those cases. But how will we find what actually happened? God knows. When that information is available. You see, we never have access to the victims. That's always closed off. Israelis will never allow you. So how do we judge? All we know is that it's a war going on. And a war is never pretty. So let's not very much bother. I do not want to say that Israelis also commit atrocities, therefore you have to commit atrocities. Of course, Israelis commit much more atrocities. If I want, I can make that kind of argument. The horrors that the Israelis have committed in Lebanon in the 1980s and so on are unspeakable. And what is happening daily by what the Israelis do is equally unspeakable. And what they've done, of course, in the genocidal campaign is 10 times worse than what anything Hamas has done. But I don't want to say that is bad and therefore you are justified in doing it. That's not the point. What is the evidence is what I'm looking at. And I have my doubts.
Good afternoon. Yeah, we appreciate your speech. It was very impressive.
Thank you.
But now this Hamas, we know they are freedom fighters. But most of them in India, even including, for example, leaders, just tell them as terrorists. Yes, we cannot call Subhash Chandra Bose or Shahid Bhagat Singh as terrorists. How can they say Abbas as terrorists?
Sorry, we can't say Subhash Chandra Bose and Sheikh Abdullah what?
They are not a terrorist because they are freedom fighters with weapons. So by handling weapons, how can we call them terrorists? Suppose this Bhagat Singh also was throwing bomb to the parliament, inside the Indian parliament. So we are calling him freedom fighter and all this respect. That's my another thing. This what's the real solution for this Palestinian cause? Two-nation theory they are telling. Only I think United States is opposing it. If any day come, they will come to this conclusion for a permanent solution.
Yeah. Well, I don't think there's any solution to the Palestinian problem, and there cannot be. The one party that can find a solution, the one party that can impose a solution, not find one, and impose one, is the United States. They can. But they will not, because they support Israel 100%. Now, this is a question that's always raised. Why does America support Israel to the hilt in this fashion? You see, in colonial times, the British Empire believed in the Suez Canal as so important for their empire in India. Even that is doubtful whether it was so important, but they believed it and used that as a justification for all that they did. But that's no longer of any importance to America. America has other means of controlling the world. It doesn't need the Suez Canal, and therefore doesn't need Israel at all. And if it is a question of keeping the Arab world under control and the whole of the Muslim world under control, it doesn't need Israel to do it. Americans can do it independently, because the Muslim countries themselves are collaborating with the Americans in doing so. You don't need the Israelis to do so. Egypt, Saudi Arabia, all these people are more than happy to work with the Americans to keep their respective populations under control. So why are the Americans accepting this level of genocidal horror in the Middle East at great cost to their own moral leadership of the world, you might say? Of course, the usual answer given is that the Jewish lobby in America or the Israeli lobby in America are so influential that they can dictate a lot of policy. And a lot of evidence has come of that kind. They can perhaps influence American policy to a substantial degree, but we've also seen that they cannot. They need not be able to do so. As I said, in 1956, America just told Israel to get out. And they had to get out, without a doubt, when they tried to act unilaterally. In 1982, Reagan told Menachem Begin, stop this Holocaust in Lebanon. On the phone he told him, and overnight the invasion stopped. So if America says no, Israel actually obeys. That's well known. But America, if it doesn't say no, is it because of the Jewish lobby? Not certain. Why should they submit to a Jewish lobby? The American state is too large for the Jewish lobby to control. I would suggest something else. Why should the Americans support the Palestinians in any way? When American power is functioning perfectly well. America is in a position now where there's no challenge in the world. And American power has to be demonstrated again and again. And as you will have noticed during this war, everybody in the world was practically asking, telling Biden, for God's sake, stop the war. You just need to stop the supplies to Israel, and the war will end. Actually, this war, therefore, is a demonstration of American power. America, if it wants, it can stop it in one day, and the whole world knows it can happen. They're all appealing to America. American leadership is established so firmly. And when Israel was attacked by Iran, Israel couldn't defend itself. It needed America to defend her, to stop those missiles hitting targets in Israel. So once again, America has demonstrated its leadership. The dependence of Israel upon America is demonstrated emphatically. And the dependence of the rest of the world also upon America. I mean, Ukraine is all the time appealing to America. So to America, the important part is to demonstrate its leadership capacity, not to do good in the world, not to put an end to murder and slaughter and genocide and so on. That's not the purpose. And if it's Palestinians dies, what does it matter? The rest of the Arabs are not bothered. So why should America bother? Let it go on. In a sense, it arises out of the unipolarity in the world. America is the power that can allow such a war to go on. It's a power that can stop the war to go on at any moment. It's a sheer demonstration of American power, I think, not of Israeli power. And so it goes on. There's no solution until America decides. And America doesn't see any particular reason to decide. So it'll keep up this state of tension. It makes everyone more dependent upon America. You know, keeping conflicts going is a way of exercising leadership. Who says you must impose peace? It's good to have wars if you're a leader and can win the wars. And America's in that position. So it'll not stop it.
Why this Iran is supporting Palestinians? Because as you said earlier, this nation-state formation has not happened with Saudi Arabia and other countries like Jordan and other countries. So the case with Iran too. That also has not formed a nation-state. If that be the case, why Iran is interested in supporting these Palestinians?
Iran is not actually supporting the Palestinians. Let me put it this way. Iran is competing in that world against Saudi Arabia and against Israel. It is challenging Israel in its attempts to establish a leadership of the Arab world. And Iran is challenging Saudi Arabia, that's a secondary struggle, over its attempts to establish friendship with Israel. And Iran being a Shia country, and Saudi Arabia being a leading Sunni one, it is also breaking that Sunni nexus with the Jewish state. So Iran's motive is to contain Israel and therefore protect itself from an Israeli attack in the future. One of the ways of doing so is to prop up organizations like the Hezbollah, which will attack Israel and keep Israel under pressure. It is not really interested in protecting the Palestinians or creating a Palestinian state or any such thing. Nothing of the kind. But it is using this war to put pressure upon Israel and using the Hezbollah for that. It's not standing forth as a champion of the Palestinians. Not at all, actually. They're just exploiting their situation.
My name is Dilbar. So my question is there any hope for Palestine resistance narrative globally while the whole world is being manipulated by misinformation?
You know, the narrative is being... see, in the world of academic scholarship, for example, the whole of the Israeli argument and the Palestinian argument are all set out very clearly. We get all the researches done by very good Palestinian scholars who are, of course, working in America, as it happens, ironically. And we've got as many Israeli scholars presenting the Israeli case. So the Palestinian narrative is being worked out, and the academic foundations for a Palestinian nationalism is also certainly well established and is developing further. As the PLO developed and then the Hamas developed, so did all the academic bases for all this go on. Now, it's one thing to have the narratives being worked out and established, but the next step to have the movement which will make itself effective is always in question. But the important point is once you have the narrative and you have a nationalism, there is always a movement. I mean, there's a challenging movement always taking place. It's not like the 1920s when there was no movement, where you had only distinguished people of great eminence meeting in congresses and passing resolutions. Now you have raw movements on the ground in Palestine that's ready to fight. So, and there you do have Palestinian nationalism, which is making its case all over the world. And many are listening to them. Popular opinion in much of Europe is with the Palestinians. Even in America is with the Palestinians. So there's a lot of worldwide support. And for that reason, these kinds of challenges will continue to be presented. And one day, we do not know, it's just possible that a Palestinian state could be created. But I am skeptical. It should have been created in 1948, it didn't happen. And will it happen now, after so long and such heavy losses? We don't know. The only conditions on which it will happen is if the United States wants this problem out of the way in order to focus on something else. Then it will impose a solution and tell the Israelis to go back into barracks. But I cannot sort of start speculating on what are those particular conditions that might create those possibilities. We do not know yet. So for the present, it looks very pessimistic. And the hopeful sign is that the Palestinians do have a nationalism, which works, in this way at least.
കോളിൻസൺ ലൈബ്രറി എഴുതിയ പുസ്തകമുണ്ട് സർ, ഓ ജെറുസലേം എന്ന പുസ്തകം. അതിൽ പറയുന്ന കാര്യങ്ങൾ എത്രത്തോളം വസ്തുതാപരമാണ്?
This is, of course, Jerusalem is a subject of such enormous research and controversy. Not controversy. The trouble is, Jerusalem has such levels of occupation and interest by everybody, all the religions, that it cannot be disentangled. Everyone has to be in Jerusalem. The Jews, the Muslims, and the Christians. Nothing ever comes to an end. Well, that is, I don't think that everyday account of people like that, well, it is factually correct, of course. It tells you in a day-to-day fashion what happened. But I don't think it's much more than that. And, you've seen his account in what happened in India, how they've written the book. It just gives you everyday experience of what happens there. Nothing more than that. And as such, it is a very good book. Yes, it always is, what these people write. But I wouldn't treat it as anything more than that, as serious history beyond that point. It is like very detailed newspaper reporting. That's how it is.
You are telling about the positions of the Jews in other Arab and Islamic countries. There are so many Arab Jewish nationals, Jewish in Arab countries and even Iran with their nationality. Even in Iran, even Israel admits that the Jews in Iran are safe and happy. So how it can be considered as a broad outlook of the Muslims and Arabs in all these cases?
Can we consider it?
Well, this is the broad outlook of the Muslims and Arabs in these cases. For example, in Iran, they suffered a lot from the hands of Israel. Their president was recently killed. Hamas leader was there killed. And many of their atomic scientists were killed. And again, soldiers were killed. Still, they never suspected any Jewish, never questions his royalty. This cannot be happen even in India.
You see, there's a big difference between the fate of the Jews in Europe and those in the rest of the world, especially the Muslim world. In the Muslim world, the Jews are just one community amongst many others. And as a separate community, they suffer the fate or enjoy the advantages of being an autonomous community, depending on how the political system there functions. But generally, they haven't been subject to the kind of persecution that they have been in Europe. Be it in Iran or Central Asia or in the Arab world in general, the Jews have been able to survive there certainly more comfortably than in Europe. Because, number one, only the Christians have this case against the Jews, that they are the ones who murdered Christ. To the Muslims, that is not a question at all. Secondly, under conditions of nationalism, the Jews are not a problem because nationalisms are not so developed in other parts of the world as in Europe. It's not so extreme. The Europeans are the most extreme nationalists. So everybody else is suspect. In the Arab world, anybody who's a nationalist, which are the nations? If you are within Egypt, you have so many Syrians working perfectly, and you can be equally Jewish, you can be Christian, you can be Lebanese. There are so many different communities right across, and the Jews are just one of them. So there's not been a serious problem of anti-Semitism in the Arab world that way. Of course, it might now grow as a problem. In Europe and America, any hostility to Israel is always represented as anti-Semitism. And therefore that the Muslims are anti-Semitic, are becoming anti-Semitic. This is a false narrative, I would say. That's not how it is. The word anti-Semitic has a peculiar weight to it. Today in Europe, anti-Semitism means what Hitler did. It's always associated with 20th century European anti-Semitism and the Holocaust. That is what it actually implies when they use the word anti-Semitic. And that's why it's almost a crime to be anti-Semitic. But elsewhere, it is only at the level of community conflict and prejudice. You have so many different communities in different areas in the Middle East or Iran, and the Jews are just one of them. The Jews are not singled out particularly to be attacked. Not at all. That's a European problem.
India was once an ally of Pakistan, a stronger ally of Palestine. But now it has changed. India has made a red carpet to Yasser Arafat once. But now everything has changed. Now India has taken the stand much stronger pro-Israel stand. What is the reason behind this? Is it because of some of the commonalities between Zionism and the ideology of present Indian government? Or is it because of the electoral autocracy, that what it is called the electoral politics, or both?
Okay.
What is your opinion about this, sir?
Yeah. For long, the Indian government was, of course, very sympathetic to the Palestinian cause on a number of grounds. The fundamental ground of the earlier governments was that India was a leader in decolonization, and they saw Palestine, saw the Israeli foundation of the actions of Israel as a form of colonial, as an expression of colonial power, the way it was operating, and opposed it. Secondly, of course, there's a calculation on the sympathy on what Muslims in India would feel, and therefore they support a cause that was dear to Muslims around the world, which Palestine was. And it was important to integrate Muslim feeling in India to create unity within India. That was the foundations of secularism in the Nehru years and so on, and thereafter also. But after all that, after, I would say, the 1980s, after the defeat of Khalistan in India, I think the Indian leaderships, Congress or Hindutva, are confident that Indian unity is not going to be threatened. India is completely secure now. In the earlier days, there's always a fear for Indian unity under Jawaharlal Nehru and even afterwards, as we saw in the 1980s attack in Punjab, the Khalistani attack. But now not at all. And it's immediately after that Hindutva becomes so powerful and prominent. It now doesn't care. You do not have to cultivate and integrate Muslim opinion within Indian politics. That's how they see it. And they can go right roughshod. And one aspect of that is now allying with Israel and not bothering about the Palestinian cause. Their argument is, number one, the Arabs themselves are not interested. So what Muslim cause are you really supporting? When most of the Muslims in the world are not interested in the Palestinian cause. At least the Muslim states are not. Muslim populations might be, but Muslim states are not. And the government of India deals with the Muslim states. So why are we wasting our energies? That was the point. Secondly, Israel was always keen that India come on board as a friend of Israel. Israel has never been hostile to India. It's always waiting for India to establish friendship. And then the government of India finds Israel a much better partner than any of the Arab states for a whole host of things, especially on defense technology matters. Because Israel is so much of an extension of the American system that you get a lot of defense technology and support and a whole lot of dirty tricks also with it. The Israelis know how to do undercover work on a big way and are prepared to collaborate with India. All these stories we keep hearing now about India carrying out assassinations in different parts of the world, whether true or not, there's an indication that we are collaborating with Israel at a certain level in these matters. We seem to be carrying out assassinations even in Pakistan successfully. It's only when we went as far as Canada and America that we got the rap. Otherwise it was going on quite well. And how is that it started so suddenly now, after the close association with Israeli intelligence? So Israel has turned out to be a very useful partner for all matters of defense in every way. And therefore the government of India doesn't see any reason not to partner with Israel. There's no dividend from supporting the Palestinian cause, which Muslim states themselves are not supporting. So why should India, was the picture. So that's why I think we've changed. But it has occurred at two levels. Because we are not fearful of Indian unity. I think that's a fundamental question, reason. So the integration of Islam, of Muslims, is not a top priority anymore. And hence Hindutva can act the way it does. But externally, the Arabs are not interested. The Muslim states are not interested. Why should we? And Israel is much more useful. And Israel is ready. There's no other conflict with Israel.
Good evening, everyone. I have been asked to express my vote of thanks on behalf of ZARINA Trust. My first expression of thanks should be to ZARINA herself, very close friend of mine, more than a friend, a sister, a person of great talent. She could paint, she could write, she could translate, she could cook very well, give us culinary tips as well. More, above all, she was such a lovable and loving person too. So my thanks to ZARINA and Marsha. You call him Professor Sudhakaran, I call him Marsh. And my entire family also, including my 5-year-old grandson, call him Marshe. He is so much part of our family. So they have given us such a great platform where we are meeting every month such great scholars. And they are showering us with so much of information. And I cannot thank Marsh enough for that. So today especially, we have got such a great scholar who has filled our brains with so much of information that it is food for 1 month at least for our brain, isn't it? You will all agree with me. A formal expression of thanks, I don't think he needs it, because being a teacher, he can very well understand from your faces how grateful you are to him for giving so much of information. He has done so much of research on it, and we know how much manipulated news have been injected into our brains. So getting such a realistic information is indeed very, very gratifying. So our sincere thanks to you, sir, for this great oration. And as also you have done the favor of honoring such a great speaker as Professor Veluthad Keshavan, who also spoke to us. He was one of the first or second speakers in the ZARINA Trust, and you did the honor of presenting the memento to him. And we are also very thankful for you for doing this on our behalf. And I express my sincere gratitude to all the people who have come here and who have interacted very well with Professor Madhavan. And I thank you all for being here and supporting this ZARINA Trust. Thank you all.